Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And although so many questions have been asked, I do have a few questions for the good chairman of Public Health. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Please proceed, Madam.
I'm looking at lines 1103 and 1104, which now prohibit vaping outside schools and daycare centers. May I ask, through you, Mr. Speaker, how notification is going to be given to these institutions? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the good representative's question, we do not explicitly state the means by which we communicate that, as is the case in any number of laws that we create. I would imagine the scholastic community is paying close attention to the deliberations of this body and will be eager to implement a program which will stem this growing problem they have on their grounds. Then they may not be sufficient. We do have agencies who are responsible for promulgating protocols involved, but I would also suggest it's a very good thought that perhaps it's incumbent upon all of us as legislators to make sure that we interact with our local school districts and make sure they're aware of what we're trying to do on their behalf. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do concur, although one of my concerns as we pass legislation, very often we simply don't stipulate a method through which people are going to be informed. I believe one of the gun bills we passed did stipulate that DESP should have on their website the new regulations. And I would like to see perhaps the Office of Early Childhood be instructed to produce this on their website, and even if we don't have to state it in statute, that the conversations are held to encourage that. I'm sure the schools will find out fairly quickly. I see, according to the fiscal note, that there's a projected revenue loss both in terms of the excise taxes and the sales taxes from 18 to 20-year-olds who will no longer be allowed to purchase these products. Through you, Mr. Speaker, may I ask where the numbers were derived that result in these figures? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We often ask the Office of Fiscal Analysis to make projections based upon assumptions. And we were looking at the amounts of the fees and penalties, the number of entities we believe would be subject to those, and made certain assumptions. To the good representative's point, we knew there would be a hit to revenue by changing the age. The fee penalty structure somewhat mitigates that impact. It was a hard decision for us in a state that is struggling to balance its budget to reduce an existing revenue source. And I can only emphasize it's because of the public health imperative here that we felt that this was something where we would have to find a way to get it done, even if it did have some impact on revenues. But to answer your question explicitly, I can't tell you the precise formula. I wouldn't say OFA operates in mysterious ways. They have a methodology, and we've been in contact with them recently. And we're hopeful that the information we gave them led them to good projections. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for that answer. And yes,
Cheeseman.
I won't refer to the OFA's deliberations as mysterious, but I wondered if this were based on random sampling of retailers or whether there was any specific research that had been conducted behind it. And speaking of research, do we know have there been recent studies on the number of Connecticut teenagers between 18 and 21 who are currently vaping? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, in my opening remarks, we did talk about the incidence of such activities among young people between the years 2015 and 2017 to having more than doubled from 7% to over 14%. And I would argue it's probably even higher than that in more recent years. We're talking about a lot of kids in our schools. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you. And I presume the assumption was that nationwide statistics probably apply to Connecticut. Now, moving on to the increased fees and registration licenses, Is it anticipated, and I didn't see this in the fiscal note, that any of these changes may result in retailers not retailing these items? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the representative for the question. It is certainly not our intent to dictate to retailers what they should or should not sell. I imagine it's possible that some retailers will decide that there's more profit in selling other items. I'm sure they make those kind of decisions all the time based upon the costs of doing business. I imagine the reputable retailers involved with this will make the adjustments if this is a business they choose to be in. But I could not predict what any individual business entity might choose to do with regard to sales of this product. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you for the answer. And I know this bill doesn't contain that, but as was discussed earlier, the governor's budget included quite a significant increase in the taxes on e-cigarettes, and a concern I have, and I believe I voiced in finance, was the effect this may have on adult smokers who are using this electronic method as a smoking cessation technique. And as the good chair of public health is aware, 480,000 Americans every year die from cigarette smoking. Is there a concern that this could adversely affect those adult smokers who are viewing this and using this as a way to give up that incredibly dangerous habit of smoking tobacco? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it's almost natural that we had a conversation about the general effects on those who have chosen e-cigarettes and vaping products to seek to reduce their nicotine intake and to avoid or eliminate addiction. Frankly, we don't really address this because this is only about those under the age of 21. It is a broader issue that I'm hoping will be addressed on the national level. We felt it was appropriate for us to focus on those under the age of 21 and ideally interdict the potential for addiction early on in the process such that they don't find themselves as adults with this problem. So to answer the representative's question, no, we do not explicitly address that. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you for that answer, and I do understand that this only addresses that problem with underage smoking, and this is purely editorial comment. I hope as we go forward, we take into account that given the incredibly proven destructive effect of cigarette smoking, that any legislation we pass does not end up discouraging people who are going to rely on this as a method of giving up smoking. And those are the rest of my question, all my questions. I thank the good chair of public health. I do have a few further comments. As someone who had smokers in the family, including a husband who was a 3-pack-a-day smoker who started at 15 and thank God gave up, the power of addiction is incredibly strong. And not only the substances that are in that product, but the habituation. You get used to doing something. You get used to doing something and lighting up a cigarette or having a drink or whatever. So I think anything that could stop this process in its tracks, particularly with our young people who are the most vulnerable, whose brains, as we are learning as the research progresses, are so much more susceptible to those negative influences and impacts. And I am in strong support of this. I too had my doubts about it, but as our children are our most precious, precious resource, we need to protect them. And I will echo what Representative Mastro Francesco said before. As we debate this, as we hopefully approve and pass this bill, let us bear this in mind as we have the debate on retail marijuana. Let us not normalize a habit, a product that we know now through research is so destructive to those developing minds. 14 to 21-year-olds now view marijuana as harmless by only 14%. So we talk about the revenue loss here. We talk about revenue gains with retail marijuana. What about the lives that will be lost? What about those 18, 19, 14, 15-year-olds who will be lost to us? So I urge support of this bill today, but I hope we show as much concern for this age group and everyone else in our state when we debate retail marijuana. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.